Hey, Potomac kids, it's Miss Conley. I'm back again with Freedom Crossing, Chapter 7 and 8. Hope you're doing well. Sorry this is coming to you a day late, my bad. But hopefully you will be able to catch up on chapters 1 through 6 and then read 7 and 8 with me today. So hopefully tomorrow I will be able to put 9 and 10 on. But we're at a good part in the book now. This is when Martin is trying to find a good hiding place, and Bert and Laura are trying to keep him hidden well and trying to decide what they're going to do because Joel Todd has left, and now they got to figure out what to do with Martin. And so when we left off, there was the dogs were getting closer, and the dogs are what are smelling Martin, and so now they are sorry, I had to look at the book for a second. But they are realizing that the dogs are getting closer, which means the slave catchers are getting closer. And also Laura is getting the realization that Martin was not treated well as a slave, as she sees the scars on his back. So that's where we left off. So we're going to read chapter 7 and 8 today. Okay, so here we are with chapter 7, The Slave Catchers Come. Deeply upset by the sight of the scars on Martin's back, Laura went up to her room, leaving him still at work in the pantry. She took out her needlework and sat in her rocker by the west window. She was sewing a ruffle on the bottom of the green cotton dress to make it longer, for she had decided it showed a little too much of her ankles. But she was not thinking of her sewing. Her mind was in turmoil over the happenings of the past few hours. It seemed that her world was turning upside down. At Uncle Jim's, she had only seen gentle treatment of slaves. His slaves were never beaten, and if they were ill, Aunt Ruth cared for them as if they were her own children. Laura wanted to believe that all plantation owners were as kind as the Montgomerys. But Martin's scars were proof that this was not true. Perhaps, she told herself, he was lying and had been beaten because he had done something bad, like stealing. Yet even that wouldn't be a reason for so cruel a beating. Besides, she believed Martin had told her the truth. As she puzzled, she rocked furiously, and her sewing lay in her lap. The clock on the front stair landing chimed 9. The slave catchers had had time to get a warrant to search the house. Since no one had appeared, Laura tried to convince herself they had decided not to come. At any rate, Bert was outside watching the road, so he would stop anyone who approached. But every time a dog barked or hoofbeats sounded on the road, she stiffened in alarm. She wondered if Joel would come this morning. Probably not, for he wouldn't want to draw attention to their house. She liked his appearance since he had grown up. He wasn't exactly handsome, but he looked to be the kind of person you could trust. It was a pity he had such strong ideas about slavery. Deep in thought, Laura was startled to hear voices in the front house. She ran to the front window and looked down at a group of men, one of whom wore a sheriff's badge. The bell in the front hall rang as someone tugged on the bell pull outside the door. Then Laura heard the doorknob being tried. "It's locked," one of the men shouted. He stepped back and stared up at the house. Laura dropped the lace curtain, hoping he had not seen her gazing out. She was horrified to realize that these strangers would have walked directly into the house if the door had not been locked. Again, she wished Prince were alive. He would have never let them into the house. Through the thin curtain, she could see the men walking together, apparently trying to decide what to do next. Bert came around the corner of the house on the run, with the wide tinned fork he used for digging potatoes still in his hand. "Good morning," he called out. The men whirled around. "Oh, good morning, Bert." The sheriff coughed nervously. "We've come to look through your house. I hope you have no objection." "Why'd you come?" asked Bert. Laura was amazed at his unruffled manner. "You know well enough," one of the men growled. Bert turned to him, and Laura could see the surprised lift of his eyebrows. She had not guessed her brother was such an actor. The sheriff said politely, "We're looking for a runaway slave, and some people think Joel Todd brought him here last night." "I heard there was a fugitive around," said Bert. "Of course you could search the house." He paused. "I guess you have a search warrant." "That we have," said one of the men, a young fellow with a crest of black hair. I bet you're sorry to hear that. Show 'em the warrant, Sheriff." "Don't hurry me, Walt." The sheriff pulled from his pocket a paper which Bert studied carefully. The men were getting restless. The young man called Walt pushed his face close to Bert. "You know a search warrant when you see one. Now get that door open." Bert said politely, "If you wait here, I'll let you in. I only have the key to the back door with me." He fished a large key out of his pocket and held it up for all to see. "Since when do you lock the doors when you're working in the garden, Bert Eastman?" asked one of the men. "Seemed like a good idea with a fugitive loose in the countryside," said Bert, "especially since my sister's all alone in the house." Walt said, "Oh, yes, your sister. I heard she came back here from down south. Hear she's a good looker, too." Laura blushed, glad she was upstairs behind the curtain. What a rough lot those men seemed to be, all except the sheriff. And yet they were acting according to the law, trying to catch a runaway and return him to his master. It was hard for her to remember that last night she had thought it would be best for Martin to be caught and returned to his owner. As Bert started around the house, one of the men called after him, "Not so fast, Bert. I'll go with you just to see there's no monkey business. Spread out around the house, men, and make sure that darky doesn't climb out of a window." Laura was shocked by the hate in the man's voice. Why, he sounded as if he thought Martin was a criminal. She ran to the spare room. Martin was not in sight. She opened the wardrobe and whispering, "Are you in there?" pulled aside the clothes until she could see Martin's face. His wide, frightened eyes peered at her. "I'm here, Miss Laura. Don't let them catch me, please." "Stay quiet," she cautioned. She closed the wardrobe door tightly and hurried back to her room. Downstairs, the front door crashed open and booted feet sounded on the hall floor. "The cellar first," someone cried out. The men thudded through the house like a herd of buffalo. Less than 5 minutes later, footsteps pounded up the cellar steps and began to travel through the rooms on the first floor. Now and then Laura heard a crash of a chair being overturned. Standing in the middle of her room with her fists clenched, Laura's anger and fear grew with every passing moment. Judging by the noise downstairs, those men wouldn't miss a corner of the whole house. In no time they'd find Martin and take him away. She kept seeing his eyes and hearing his voice begging her not to let him be caught. Someone was on the back stairs running lightly, taking the steps 2 at a time. Still Laura could not move. The quick steps hurried down the hall to the spare room. A moment later they reached her door, and to her amazement, Bert rushed into the room, pulling Martin after him. Without a word, he flung the back carpet and knelt to lift the trap door. A man's voice came clearly up the back stairs. "He isn't down here, men. Take the next floor." Bert had the trap door open and was pushing Martin into the opening as the men swarmed up the stairs. Laura heard them go into Bert's room, and from there into the attic over the kitchen. Now Bert had the trap door in place and was pulling the rug smooth, while the searchers prowled about the spare room, tapping on the walls and even opening bureau drawers. What did they expect to find in a drawer? Laura wondered in amazement. The loud voices carried easily into her room. "Look under the mattress," one said. "I heard about a darky who crawled under a feather bed. The only way they found him, the feathers tickled his nose and he sneezed." "Look in that closet over there," said another man. "That's a dandy place. Look good behind those clothes." Bert pulled Laura's rocking chair into the middle of the room, directly over the trap door, and shoved her into it, none too gently. "So," he commanded. Now the searchers were at the door of her room. Chapter 8, Moses is a Woman. Seeing a girl seated in a rocking chair with her sewing in her lap, the men stopped in the doorway. The young man Laura had noticed outside her window, the young one the sheriff had called Walt, was the first to recover. "Well, look who's here," he exclaimed, swaggering across the threshold. "It's young Miss Eastman herself, just as pretty as I heard she was." Laura's anger rose to the boiling point. She had no objection to being told she was pretty, but the young man's tone was so familiar that she felt insulted. Bert should put him out of the house. But Bert had disappeared. Without rising from her chair, she demanded angrily, "What right do you have to come into my room?" Even to her own ears, her accent was as pronounced as her Aunt Ruth's. No Southern gentleman would think of doing such a thing. Walt did not move. "Why are we high mighty?" His eyes, bold and mocking, never left Laura. The sheriff stepped forward. "We have a warrant to search the house, Miss Eastman. These men," he motioned to the troop behind him, "are looking for a runaway slave." Laura clutched the sewing in her lap, stabbing her hand on the needle as she did so. The sudden pain made her more annoyed than ever. Then please proceed, she said. She tried to look composed, though her hands were shaking. My father won't be happy at the way your men are treating the furniture. They aren't my men, the sheriff said unhappily. They've come in from the south mostly, and the law says I have to cooperate with them. You know I wouldn't have come here on my own. Your father is an old friend of mine, and I don't want to lose his goodwill. He stepped aside and turned to the men in the hallway. Come in and look around and be quick about it. The men shuffled uneasily and murmured among themselves. Two of them took a few steps into the room and glanced about. Walt was the only one who failed to look embarrassed. He strolled to the wardrobe and took a leisurely survey of Laura's dresses, crisply ironed and scented with lavender. One of the other men said, Come on, Walt. Sorry. We don't need to worry about this room. The little southern lady isn't going to harbor any slave in here. Walt stooped to inspect the floor of the wardrobe and rapped on the wall beside it as if looking for a hidden room. Laura bent her head over the sewing to hide her anxious eyes. By the time they finally left, she felt limp. The group went across the hall to her parents' room, poked their heads into the sewing room, and then clattered down the stairs. The sheriff came back to Laura to apologize again for the intrusion. I hope you realize I'm just doing my duty. Tell your pa that, will you? Yes, I'll tell him. For a moment after the sheriff left, Laura sat without moving. Then she went into the hall where she could hear the men who were gathered downstairs in the entrance. You think he got away? One asked. I figure he wasn't here at all. Maybe Joel never brought him, or if he did, that little spitfire upstairs wouldn't let him in. Did you hear her? No southern gentleman would think of doing such a thing. This remark was followed by laughter. Another voice said grimly, I'm not so sure. Did you see those clothes hanging behind the stove? Bert said they were his, but I don't believe it. Not for a minute. I say, let's keep an eye on the house. The sheriff cut in. Let's go, he ordered. Laura moaned to herself how foolish they had been to leave Martin's clothes in plain view. Bert should have known better, and so should she. Feet shuffled in the hall downstairs, and then the door closed. Bert came up the back way. He was grinning. Nice job, sis. Laura looked up at him, bit her lip, and burst into tears. Bert said awkwardly, Hey, don't cry now. It's all over. Laura rubbed her eyes on her sleeve. It was so terrible. I was so scared. He looked surprised. You don't act scared. You just acted mad. He rolled back the rug. Now let's see how Martin feels. He lifted the trap door and he announced to Martin, They've gone. Martin was obviously shaken. He took a deep breath and raised himself to the edge of the opening. There he slumped down and glanced around the room as if to assure himself the men were indeed gone. I feel like that man in the Bible, Lazarus, he said with a feeble smile. It's like a tomb in there. Laura couldn't resist smiling. Where did you hear about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead? My pappy used to read the Bible to us every day. All the time he read that book. You better be thankful for this tomb, Bert told him. If you'd stay in the wardrobe in the spare room, you'd be on your way down south right now. Martin shuddered. I wasn't easy about that wardrobe. I sure do thank you for taking me out of it, and you too, Miss Laura, for letting me stay here. Laura felt she was receiving credit she didn't deserve. Bert didn't give me any choice. You didn't tell on me, Martin pointed out. Again, she refused to accept his praise. I had to think of my father. He'd be in bad trouble if you were found here. Bert looked at her sharply. Well, whatever your reasons were, I'm glad you kept your mouth shut. We shouldn't have any more trouble now. Joel will come after Martin tonight, and that'll be the end of it. Didn't you hear them? Asked Laura. They saw Martin's clothes in the kitchen. They said they were going to watch the house. Bert groaned. I knew I should have burned those clothes. They're the only clothes I have. Martin looked shocked. You can keep mine, said Bert. They're too small for me anyway. Thank you. Martin smoothed the front of the blue wool shirt. They're a lot warmer than mine. I need warm clothes here up north. Laura smiled at him. I'll go down and burn those old clothes right now, Martin offered. You better stay right where you are. Bert went to the windows. If they've got ideas about your clothes, they may come back thinking they'll catch us by surprise. Martin looked at Laura. I don't want to be in Miss Laura's way. Couldn't I go back to the cellar? Bert left the window. Do you know what they did to the sacks of potatoes? Martin shook his head wordless. One of those slave hunters took a knife out of his pocket and stabbed it into every bag. Laura felt sick. If Martin had been in one of those potato bags, she would have never forgiven herself for keeping him out of the secret room. Do I have to stay in the hole? Martin asked. No, Bert replied, but you have to be able to get into it in a hurry. We'd better figure that out. What if you were all alone here and you heard the slave catchers at the front door? I'd quick jump in the hole and pull the lid over my head. And how would you get the rug back in place? Asked Bert. Martin thought this over. I'd reach out of the hole and pull that carpet over top of me. Bert looked doubtful. Let's see you do it. He and Laura watched while Martin lowered himself into the hidden room and pulled the rug over his head. Like a mole, he crawled under it until he had it in place, then wormed back under the carpet to the opening and pulled the trap door shut. His muffled voice asked, "How's that?" The rug was wrinkled, but Laura thought Martin had done well under the circumstances. "You'd better practice," advised Bert, as Martin came into sight. "Keep working at it until you can do it fast and get the rug smoother." He started for the door. "I'm going down and get rid of your clothes." At the door he paused. "Let's see your shoes." Martin held up his feet, saying apologetically, "These shoes have done a lot of walking." Laura could see his feet through the large holes in the bottom of the shoes. "That's what I thought," Bert said. He trotted down the hall to his room and returned shortly, carrying socks and a pair of shoes. "See if you can wear these." Martin pulled them on. "Pretty good fit. But they look new. You shouldn't have given them to me." "That's all right," said Bert. "My old shoes would be too small for you. I notice you have good-sized feet for the height of you. Once you get started growing, you'll be a tall fellow." Laura had recognized Bert's best shoes. She said nothing. If her brother was willing to wear his everyday shoes to church, that was his affair. But her heart warmed toward him for his generosity. When Bert left for the kitchen, Laura went down with him. She watched while he stoked the fire in the stove and stuffed Martin's ragged shirt and trousers. Since they were still damp, they burned slowly. Bert picked up the shoes he had placed on the floor beside the stove and looked despairingly at the smoky fire in the stove. "Guess I'll burn these in the fireplace." Soon the kitchen, heated by 2 fires, was uncomfortably warm. Laura was worried. "Bert, it's too late now, but suppose the slave catchers decide to come back for a closer look at those clothes. I'll just say we decided they were too worn out and not worth keeping at all, so we burned them," he said, poking a smoldering shoe. Laura opened the back door. The bright autumn day seemed to beckon her. The field behind the vegetable garden was aglow with goldenrod and wild asters. Beyond that, the trees in the woodlot were yellow and crimson. She longed to go outside, but she was afraid of meeting the slave catchers. They might waylay her and ask questions. She especially dreaded meeting the one named Walt. There was something so ruthless about him. She knew he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Martin. Relentlessly, she turned back to the kitchen. The clock, ticking loudly on the mantel, caught her eye. 11 o'clock, she said aloud. "Will this day never end?" Bert added more wood to the stove. "If you do a little work, the time would go faster." He picked up a brush and went outside, where he began to clean the potatoes he had dug. "You don't have to tell me what to do, little brother," said Laura. Her pride was injured at criticism from Bert. It used to be the other way around. She was the one who gave him orders. "Somebody ought to boss you," he called, brushing with furious energy. "You haven't done a lick of work since you came here. In case you've forgotten, up north we don't have slaves to do everything for us." Laura turned red. She felt like slapping him. She hated to admit that what he said was true. Laura started up the stairs to her room. Then she remembered it was no longer her refuge, but Martin's. Slowly she returned to the kitchen. She stared at Bert, who was still on the back steps, brushing the potatoes and putting them into a sack. No doubt he'd take them down to the root cellar to store with the other potatoes and apples and carrots. "Apples," she thought. "I'll show him." Snatching up a pan, she hurried to the cellar. She took a dozen apples from a barrel and returned to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was burning well now, and if she was quick about it, she could have fresh applesauce ready for lunch. Bert grinned wickedly when she called him to lunch. He piled applesauce generously onto one of Mrs. Fitch's biscuits. "What's the idea?" he asked. "Trying to prove you still know how to cook?" Laura didn't answer, and when he went upstairs with 2 plates of food for himself and Martin, she told herself she was glad to be alone. Then she heard a burst of laughter from upstairs. It made her feel lonely and left out. She closed the bar and barred the back door. Then she, too, filled her plate and climbed the stairs. Bert and Martin were sitting on the edge of the secret opening with their feet dangling in space. Martin greeted her enthusiastically with, "This is the best applesauce I ever ate." Bert, too, seemed glad to see her. He slapped the floor beside him. "Have a seat." "What were you laughing about?" Laura asked, sitting down in the rocker with self-conscious dignity. I heard you just before I came up." Bert seemed puzzled and turned questioning eyes to Martin. Martin looked at Bert and then shyly at Miss Laura. "We were talking about you, Miss Laura, sitting on top of the trap door, and those slave catchers saying no little Southern lady would hide me. Bert told me how they said that." Laura was aware that Martin was watching for her reaction. His big eyes never left her face. She smiled, and he smiled back at her and continued more confidently. "I heard that old chair go creak, creak when you rocked, Miss Laura, and I was ready to bust out laughing down there in that little hole." "Weren't you scared I'd tell on you?" Laura asked. Again, Martin seemed to hesitate. He glanced at Laura and then fastened his eyes on the floor. Finally, he said in almost a whisper, "I was praying you wouldn't." So he had been afraid she'd tell on him. Well, she hadn't earned his trust, she admitted. He trusted Bert. Martin talked to him as freely as he'd talk to another black boy. But when he spoke to her, he seemed to be afraid of displeasing her. She had noticed the same manner in Uncle Jim's slaves whenever they spoke to white people. She became aware that Martin staring earnestly at her, so she said gently, "Go ahead, don't be afraid to speak up." "I was just going to say," again Martin's gaze traveled to the floor, "nobody who took me and told on me ever since I ran away. Lots of folks hid me, black folks and white ones. They could have sent me back to my master for the big reward, but they didn't." "So lots of people helped you," Laura said thoughtfully. "Yes'm, I couldn't even count how many. Moses, she said people who help the poor runaway slaves are the kindest people in the world." "Moses," Bert laughed. "Moses was a man, and he lived hundreds of years ago." Martin shook his head. "Not the Moses I mean. She's a woman, all right, and she's as black as I am, and she led a whole lot of slaves to the promised land." "Oh," Bert looked delighted. "I know who you mean. Her name's Harriet Tubman, isn't it? She was a slave herself, and she escaped to Canada. Then she went back down south and helped other slaves get away." "Miss Tubman, that's her name, only everybody calls her Moses. My pappy talked to her, and he told her how his master was going to sell him down south and split up our family. So when Miss Tubman was ready to go north, she came outside our cabin and sang, 'Go down, Moses.' My pappy heard her, and he said, 'There's Moses, it's time for us to go.' Can you sing it?" asked Bert. "Let's hear the song, 'Go Down, Moses.'" Martin appeared glad to oblige. He rocked back and forth as he sang softly, "Oh, go down, Moses, way down into Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." Laura's eyes felt misty. Martin's high, sweet young boy's voice was appealing. Though she had heard Uncle Jim's slaves sing the same song, she had never guessed its hidden meaning. The slaves must think of themselves as the Israelites. But Pharaoh, who was he? Their master? "Moses leads slaves to the promised land?" she asked, wondering. "That's right, Miss Laura. She takes them to Canada. That's the promised land where we can be free." "Why didn't you stay with your family?" Laura asked. "They're in Canada already." "I got sick with the measles, and Pappy didn't want to make trouble for the kind Quaker lady we were staying with. She didn't have room to keep hiding so many of us. Moses said I could come on later when I got well, and the Quaker lady took care of me. Miss Tubman, she—" Bert raised his hand for silence. "Listen, someone's at the front door." Okay, so that's chapter 7 and 8. And again, someone's at the front door. Uh-oh. Hopefully those slave catchers haven't come back again. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed chapter 7 and 8, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.